I don't know what the official greeting is, but happy World Digital Preservation Day will do for now. And it's been already quite a busy time. We're only just not even lunchtime here in Glasgow, but it's already been a pretty full on day of activities. We've got an hour ahead of us to introduce the 2023 revision of the BIT list, the global list of endangered digital species. There's a major revision of the BIT list, which we'll hear about in a moment. And there's some quite striking, quite important conclusions and some quite important actions that will follow from the BIT list as a consequence of the work that has been done. In a moment, Amy will introduce all of that because Amy has been carrying an awful lot of the BIT list work and delivering it for us. But my job really is to just remind us all about the BIT list, remember where it comes from, and remember its purposes, and to just sort of put it into context. So many of you with long history in digital preservation will remember, kind of the early days of digital preservation. There was great kind of gloom, really, a great kind of worry that what we were facing was a digital dark age. I don't know if anyone can remember those, kind of spooky times that, everything was going to come crashing down because, a change in format or a change in data storage or something would get in the way, and that would be the end of things. Well, of course, those narratives are very eye-catching. I understand why they make good copy and sell newspapers, but they're also self-defeating. A disaster which is only 18 months away is always only ever 18 months away to some extent. And moreover, the simple fact of observation changes the outcome here. I can't remember what the name is for the scientific effect where observing something causes a change in its outcomes. But there's something about that in digital preservation. The fact that people have noticed this means that in, the late 1990s, in the UK, for sure, the Warwick workshops were underway. The Digital Preservation Coalition was being imagined and brought into existence, and exactly because those challenges had been identified and shared, and joint action was therefore planned. So we meet partly to reflect on that. We've had this idea of a digital dark age, and it's a bit self-defeating. At the same time, we've been keen always at the coalition to celebrate the successes in digital preservation, and we do that every 2 years with the Digital Preservation Awards. And it's great, by the way, to see a couple of winners of the awards with us around today. But anyway, we can celebrate the successes. How do we tell the story, though, about the real challenge that we face? Like, it's not a massive digital dark age challenge. It has changed. It is more subtle. It is more nuanced. It's more complicated, perhaps, than we originally might have realised. That's where the bit list came from. It emerged out of the DPC's advocacy and community engagement subcommittee. So it came from our members, effectively saying to us, look, we need a way of documenting, or we document successes. How do we go about documenting where attention is needed? And so there's a certain rhythm here. There's a logic. Last year, we presented the Digital Preservation Awards, the 20th anniversary set of awards. Every other year, so every 2 years we do the awards, every other year we look at where the challenges are, where the challenges lie, where do we need to set our set our targets for future work. And that really becomes, therefore, the bit list, an understanding of the emerging risks within digital preservation. It's a community endeavour. The DPC is vendor and technology neutral, so we're not pushing a particular solution. We're not pushing a particular formation even of digital preservation approach. We take a very broad brush view. We invite the community to nominate to the bit list. We invite the community to review those entries which are sent to us, and through the community we promulgate and sort of distribute the bit list. So we find ourselves here, therefore, every 2 years, we find ourselves at the point of a major review of the bit list. We're now in the 4th edition of the bit list, and a great deal has changed since then. That's all by way of context and introduction. Let's get into the bit list for 2023 now in a bit more detail. And it's my pleasure to hand over to Amy, who is going to take us through the work and the process and the outcomes for 2023.
Thanks, William. I'm going to share my screen because it was such a big year that it was impossible for me to be able to touch on all these things on their own. So hopefully that's showing up all right. And I'll get right into it. So William already touched on this. For those of you who might be here and new to the bit list, it's a community-owned resource where nominations are contributed by members of the digital preservation community. It started in advocacy. It still is primarily for advocacy because it gives a snapshot of concerns with respect to the risks faced in varied conditions and contexts. And it gives real illustrative examples as well as through case studies or examples for each of the entries. But I want to get right into some of the good stuff. But also, as mentioned, it's been around since 2017, and every 2 years it goes through a comprehensive review. So this is the third major comprehensive review leading to the fourth edition of the bit list. And a lot of it is similar to in previous years. It builds on the work of the previous reviews by juries and task forces, especially the last comprehensive one, which was in 2021, and the identification of trends last year. So the 2022 interim review was also really good for helping build upon the work that was done before. And these are just the three general areas that the review entails. So the new nominations, also existing ones, and again, having that addition and support and evidence needed. The thing that was different this year was that the management review process was significantly changed since the last publication. And this was based partly on recommendations from previous jurors and task forces and discussion with the DPC's Advocacy and Community Engagement Subcommittee, which oversees the bit list. And the most notable change was this formation of a larger expert body, the Bit List Council. And it took on an assessment role, which was previously given to smaller jury panels, but it was more strategic. It kind of returned to this idea of the red list and based around what we're calling the digital species. So those higher level thematic groupings of entries, which were categorized within the list. And this was a way to ensure that all entries were reviewed by experts from organizations representing global expertise. And it was also helped to delegate more detailed comprehensive reviews of entries first by the species rather than before, where it was a review of all of the entries by individual jury members. So the resulting recommendations were compiled and then shared and discussed among all the council members. And indeed, our hopes that this would be a more robust evaluation process with more robust evidence really was exceeded beyond what we had hoped. So actually, let's get into the good stuff, the summary findings for this year. And the first way we can see the changes since the last review is in the amount of content in the new fourth edition. We now have 87 entries compared to 73 in the previous edition. And this reflects on how the wider context has changed since a comprehensive review, but again, also how we've had more in-depth reviews by our Bit List Council and other contributors. So we've got 8 new entries. There were 13 submissions received total during the call for nominations period. 9 were received through the open online nomination process, and 4 were nominated by the Bit List Council members themselves. So they noticed where there were gaps or new entries that should be added. And 8 of the 13 submissions were added to this new bit list as new standalone entries. All of the nominations received are incorporated in the bit list. So for the remaining 5 that aren't standalone entries, they were incorporated as examples or case studies within existing entries. And some of those also came with recommendations to perhaps revisit it in the future. So all of them were valuable and were incorporated into the bit list. These are 4 of the new 8 ones, so we can see content published on the web, which cannot be easily captured through conventional web archiving practices, which is a long title, but necessary to explain the scope of these entries. We have custom online databases. We have First Nations secret and sacred culture material, which also identified areas of big gaps that we had within the bit list and ways of rethinking it as well as commercial software. And too many to fill into one slide. These are the other 4 new additions. So gaming came with console games as well as PC games. And these were noted from smartphone gaming and other gaming species. These were ones where the council members identified, hey, we're addressing this, but what about this as well? We also had native cloud formats, which touches on a lot of emerging issues relating to things like using Google Cloud and SharePoint, et cetera. And then smart TV apps, which focuses, we had smartphone gaming, and this in some ways this is similar, but also very distinct, as you'll read within the bit list details. And thank you, just pause to say thank you to all of the nominators. I think Sarah or William can confirm, I've only been helping since 2020, but I think this might be the largest amount of nominations we've received, at least in a long while. So there was also the creation of 3 new digital species. As mentioned, we worked around this idea of digital species, and closer reviews of the new and existing ones led to formation of species where they're better suited. This included cloud. These were for existing entries where cloud is emerging with its own distinct risks and contexts. So that became its own new species with these 2 existing entries under it. And then we had 2 new ones for databases and software, and these arose from 2 new entries that were added. So they didn't fit in with the existing ones, and so we've created 2 new ones for databases and software to hopefully have new entries added in the future. There were new risk classifications. This is perhaps surprising to note. This is not as great as it has been in previous years. There's only really 3 substantive changes to risk classification shown here, which include reduced risk profiles for published research data appended to journal articles and unpublished research data. We also have an increase within the gaming species for shutdown or discontinued video games, and this entry itself was something that was rescoped and narrowed within an existing one. And then additionally, this one in theory is a changed one, but our council members and formats decided that it was better to merge PDFA with PDF other than PDFA to create one entry for PDF and have it under the vulnerable classification. And within that, explain how other different types of PDA might have different risk profiles due to the format or to aggravating conditions. We had identified risk trends. So there were 6 entries additionally where there was a risk noted over the last year, but the classification had not changed. So they keep the same classification. So you can see the majority here are towards even greater risk. And this is identified by certain trends, cultural, contextual, technological, that prompted a trend, but not significant enough to say that the entire classification had changed, as well as good work and good news. So again, in research outputs, we had data published through repositories, which had a trend towards a material improvement. So indicating that there's been a lot of good work and reduced risks with action. So the most noticeable thing for me about the bit list this year was actually how little it changed in terms of what we expected with classifications and trends and those recommendations. But in this sense, it reinforces the work of prior juries. And it also, as William has touched on in the executive summary, it shows that, that the recommendations are still there, that there's still work to be done, and that executives and higher level really need to see this as an advocacy piece to prompt further action. And I'll quickly just say, because it seemed like there weren't very many changes, but there were lots. So this is the slide we used during one of our sessions where we talked about rescoping, there are tons of rescoped entries where it wasn't an addition, but each of them was really thought out in detail and narrowed or broadened in scope. And so as you go through the new bit list, you'll spot some of these in there. Notably, museum and gallery species originally just had one entry, and they realized that no, this uncovers so much more than this, and we're able to split it into 5 additional entries. So there are other things on here which are noted, and I'm keeping aware of time, and you can dig into those within the appendices of the report if you really want to get into the nitty gritty of it. And a lot of these will be picked up and revisited for our next major review. So we're going to have a 2-year cycle for the next review, and that's going to allow us that time to really dig into these recommendations. So that in mind, so many people involved in this. Could not be the bit list it was. So thank you to our council and their respective networks who've looked it over. And thank you to the additional, to our subcommittee who's responsible for the resource and provided valuable advice and editorial review. Thank you to additional people who we identified and contacted to help scope certain entries further, to our nominators again, and to our bit list users. A couple of them are here today to talk about it, which have really helped this resource grow over the year. And if you have any ideas as you go through it, we have an open nomination form. You can submit at any point and we will pick it up for the next cycle. Or if you have any feedback about the list, if you notice a typo that I probably missed, even that, go ahead and let us know so we can make it better. So I'll stop now and hand it, I believe, over to our chair of the ACE subcommittee. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right, Amy. So I think let's pause everyone, I think, online. Let's get Amy a round of applause for the work that she's been doing and putting all this together. Amy, thank you really very much. Thank you very much for delivering the vision really of the bit list, as well as all the hard work which has gone in to it. And we're going to take a moment shortly. We'll go through some of those changes. We'll get some of our speakers, panelists, just to talk through the changes and talk through the kind of the deeper dive or the deeper detail in there. But before we do that, I wonder if I can just bring Paul Stokes online. Paul is, as many of you know, chair of the DPC Advocacy Community Engagement Subcommittee. I think formally your title is Director for Advocacy and Community Engagement, very grand sounding title for us at the DPC, and that effectively therefore the board director with kind of oversight of the bit list and all the other related programs. And Paul, so you've been kind of stewarding this through as kind of board level for a few years now. And I wonder if I can just get your kind of initial thoughts or responses.
Yes, definitely. First of all, wearing my chair of the Advocacy and Communication Committee hat, congratulations to the team, an excellent job. I really love the list. It's fantastic, and I haven't spotted a single typo yet either, so that's great. But, and you know, with me, there's always a but. My overwhelming thought at this stage in 2023, when the bit list has been around for 6 years, more, whatever, is one of disappointment, because with a few notable exceptions, we haven't got the message across. We're all about authenticity, just preservation, the authentic record, and I can't help but feel pessimistic that authenticity is even further from our grasp than it's ever been. We're in the age of AI lies to us. We're in the age of deep fakes, of nefarious encryption, of an ever-increasing plethora of digital things and types, and that deluge of stuff, which, you know, I bang on about all the time. And we are in a situation where we have more entries than ever on the bit list, and things are looking, well, at best unchanged, at worst worse. And I think that part of the problem here is we're still not getting to the creators. We but by the time something's on the list, it's too late, or almost too late to do something about it. We need to get to the people who are creating the apps that create the stuff that's not usable. We need to get to the people, the application programmers, the data gatherers, the application users, and have them thinking about this sort of stuff before they create, before they write the program, and think about the ongoing keeping this stuff usable, not necessarily forever, but keeping it usable for the long term. And one of the things that also disappoints me somewhat is there are now things on the bit list from applications that didn't exist when the bit list first started. So in some ways, we have failed to get the message across to those people early enough to say that you need to think about this stuff before you create, before you write, before you gather the information. So that's basically my overall doom group. And I should say, yet again, I do love this. It's fantastic. We must keep on doing it.
I understand where you're coming from there, Paul. I mean, it's interesting. There's a sort of risk of complacency. Isn't that a theme that's maybe going to emerge here? Is the list actually hasn't changed very much, and that tells us that people have not been paying attention to the recommendations of the list. So we need to raise the roof in terms of getting those recommendations clearly in front of decision makers in this year, in which Twitter has effectively disappeared. In this year, in which a US president has been are indicted for failure and for the destruction of records. In this year, where a former British Prime Minister was unable to access public records because he forgot the password of his phone, allegedly, and another serving British Prime Minister has defied a court order for the production of records for a public judge-led public inquiry. All of these things should matter to us. These are not abstract topics. It's not for the sake of the bits and the bytes that we want to preserve this information. It's for those wider purposes. And the challenge in front of us always is how to achieve those wider purposes. And that maybe is, after that little speech, realize is my connection then to colleagues Leo and Emma, who have been exactly using the bit list for that range of functions, right? The bit list is fundamentally an advocacy tool. But it does serve a range of purposes. It enables advocacy, but it also enables prioritization. It enables communication of risks to senior management. And Leo and Emma, I know this has been very much a subject in your to-do list. So maybe I'll hand over to you to describe your own kind of approaches and uses of the bit list.
Yeah, definitely.
William.
Thanks, William.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Happy World Digital Preservation Day. Good to see you all. Very pertinent points that both Paul and William raised. I guess that matter of advocacy is difficult sometimes to do within our own institutions, using these resources to make sure that the danger to digital species is understood within the different departments of organizations, of companies, of institutions, let alone extrapolating it to the, to the much bigger scale. But as William said, we tried to do our bit here, if you excuse the pun, to use the bit list for good and see how it can fit in the work that we do at the University of Glasgow. Emma, would you like to start and tell us a bit about what we did with a bit list for advocacy and funding, money?
Yeah, sure. So we got Leo as our lovely digital archivist in 2021, I think. So before that, we've been kind of doing a wee bit of work around about our digital asset register and kind of flagging up, what type of digital records do we actually have in the University of Glasgow. So we used the bit list, as part of that to kind of flag up, right, what have we got, how does it relate to this? And then also once Leo arrived, we decided we were going to set up an archival forensics lab, but we needed money, we need investment, we need equipment, all that kind of thing. So basically we put together a business case to be submitted, and we used the bit list as part of that, saying this is the digital media that we have, these are the digital things that we've got, in order to safeguard it for the future, we need this technology, we need this space to actually be able to look after our stuff. So it was successful, which we're very happy about. So I think having the bit list as part of that was really good as that kind of advocacy tool. It was to kind of show that, we're not just making this up. This is a community grown, resource that everybody is able to use. And it kind of provided that kind of like context to the records that we're talking about. A lot of the time it's to people who don't really have that kind of in-depth knowledge of digital preservation, you know, that kind of thing. So it's just to kind of show, you know, the backup of what it is. So yeah, I'll pass over to Leo.
Thanks, Emma. And I guess as an extension of that, we realized at some point that we were amassing and we had already gathered loads of digital records in computer storage media, you know, the kind of thing that you get a deposit to university archives and there's this hard drive just kind of thrown in there for good measure. A few floppy disks, compact disks, loads of them, loads of optical media. And there came a point that we realized that somehow we had to prioritize alongside collection priorities. We had to also prioritize on the basis of which ones of these are more susceptible to obsolescence and damage over time. And that's how the storage media prioritization tool, which is not a very easy name, it doesn't really slide off the tongue. So we might name it something else. Okay, I thought Trevor, but no one was very keen on the idea. I don't know why. So this is where it came from. And I'm not going to go into detail. We presented this work at IPRES this year. So if you want to learn more, by all means, you can read the paper, and we'll be releasing this under a CC license, hopefully by the end of the year, if not, certainly by January 2024. It uses criteria, and we use the bit list as one of the criteria for a number of reasons. For one, because we consider it to be a definitive source and a community-maintained resource. As Emma said, we're not making these things up. There is substantial knowledge behind it to identify the levels of risk that different kinds of digital records and computer storage are in. We use more the kind of the integrated storage and the portable media species within the bit list. And I guess, you know, like kind of in both of these cases, what we wanted to highlight is both the value of community work in this area to keep, you know, let's say an independently verified and verifiable resource, but also to encapsulate that community knowledge into what we do, so that we're not reinventing wheels, so that we can show the value of our work, and so that we can, I guess, you know, we can show how digital preservation work that we do can be used for good across all of us.
Well, thank you very much, Leo and Emma, for that demonstration of the bit list. And by the way, I think I'm right in saying that the IPRES proceedings are due out today. I should have checked that with colleagues in Illinois before I make that announcement live. So maybe you should go and check that yourselves. But so there'll be some guidance coming out. Indeed, you can read that great paper from IPRES that Leo and Emma gave fairly soon yourselves. But listen, we've got a lot to get through. So thank you, Leo and Emma. I want to bring someone else to the mic now. And Sharon, I saw you there a moment ago, Sharon Webb. Hi, Sharon, how are you? So where I'm going with this, so Sharon, there's a few new entries to the list, okay? And there's a few new kind of findings, new entries, new components, which we kind of want to introduce, especially in kind of one that's eye-catching for me is in the community species. There's a kind of group of things around community archives and community-generated content, which you've been kind of carefully kind of guiding for us. Particularly eye-catching is a new entry for First Nations secret or sacred cultural materials. And I don't know how to phrase a question around this, except to say that it's striking to me that that's not actually a new question. That's one we've managed to overlook in all the previous iterations of the bit list, okay? And that reveals to me something about community-led processes like this, that we're trying to reflect on where there are vulnerabilities. We're trying to reflect sometimes on communities which have maybe marginalized or whose voices haven't been heard. And how do we gather that information? There's a kind of paradox here that how do we reach those communities when they are already to some extent marginalised and or overlooked? So there's work for us here. But maybe, Sharon, there's other thoughts to bring to bear on the community archive group, or some of the kind of more subtle thinking about how that has changed and improved over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. What do we mean by community? You know, it's this very loaded word, and it's used in a lot of different instances. And I think a lot of say the work around digital archives of community groups and the community generated, you know, you can look at where community is maybe trade unions, but also where community is like a critical community around action. So there's various different definitions and working guidelines around community is. And as you say, some of these are kind of self-identifying. So when it's self-identifying, the kind of, or imagined as well, it's kind of, you know, our group's always community, locally based, or imagined as kind of maybe Bennett Anderson. This is something that I do with my master's students around community archives. So it's a hot topic. But I think in terms of kind of like the new entry, the First Nations secret and sacred cultural memory material, I think the biggest thing around that was around trust and around kind of conversations of what it means to be a custodian of that type of content. And again, there are similarities with marginalized groups as well. I could think about LGBT and trans groups as well, who could think about kind of custodianship and means to access as something that is a little bit more complicated than open or closed, or kind of thinking about embargoes. So I think the complication, or the reason maybe that First Nations only kind of come in maybe now, is maybe because people are kind of like delving into what community archives mean. There has been a lot of work in Canada and Australia around First Nation cultural memory, and I think as well, obviously thinking about, you know, how the bit list can be representative. It's an ongoing process. You know, there is a sense that, you know, through the conversations that we're having, through the advocacy, that we get a kind of a sense of how some of these entries are maybe broader than they might have been. But I think it just demonstrates that these are ongoing developments, especially with First Nation Indigenous populations, where there's a lot of government action around some of this cultural heritage. So there's possibly more societal awareness, which is then reflected in the reasons why it's being brought in now. But I mean, just thinking about working with Jenny and Audrey on this, you know, we were kind of looking at the nature of, so some of these kind of community archive work is described as ad hoc, and where that is instrumental, but also where that is empowerment for the communities that are represented in this. So it's a really difficult one in terms of kind of advocacy, when there's a lot that happens outside of these institutions, because that's where those communities feel empowered. So it's that kind of, you know, difficult scenario to kind of resolve, I suppose.
And I guess there's part of me kind of thinking about what Paul's said at kind of the opening there. The reasons for the vulnerability in some cases are because the communities are themselves vulnerable, you know, yeah. And there's not a technology solution to that. Yeah. There are ways we can help with the archives and mitigate and deal with some of the aggravating conditions, but fundamentally these might be vulnerable communities, and they're always going to be a concern for us. We're always going to be looking to ways in which their memory can be preserved and looked after.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, and I think in terms of, say, the work that I do with community archives in Brighton and kind of broader field, it really is that kind of institutional responsibility to see how we can support and look to those digital preservation solutions that those communities will never have access to. So that advocacy is really important in terms of kind of collaboration, and the solutions will never come from the individual community groups. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Sharon. Thank you also for your work on in preparing and developing this for us. Very, very welcome. I wonder if I can move on, though. There's a couple of other new entries I want to kind of bring to the table. And I've got Jake on line. Jake, I think I'm right in saying you nominated one of our new entries, and I wonder if I could get you to say a word or two about that. Particularly, I'm thinking, Jake, around the content published on the web which cannot easily be captured through conventional web archiving practices. This is a new entry on the list. And Just completely on theme. I was asked this morning in a conversation with the National Archives in Malaysia, how do we preserve the dark web? And I thought, well, I don't know the answer to that, but Jake has raised that sort of topic or something like it for us here. So I wonder if I could get you to just expand a little on that, Jake.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, apologies for it being a bit of a mouthful, but as was said at the beginning, it did feel important to try and explain it a bit. I think that the kind of nice thing about being fairly new to a field is that it gives you a bit of a license to sometimes say things that are a bit obvious to experts. So for me, although this isn't a very kind of original thought, we really just wanted to emphasize again that a lot of the most interesting web content is really built in such a way as to make archiving it difficult. And thinking here particularly of dynamic and interactive content, but also quite simple things like blog sites that use post requests to load more content as you go through the page. I particularly remember when I first joined the team here at TNA being really impressed by the work they were doing to capture some of this complex content, like the UK COVID dashboard. But at the same time, we have to recognize that that level of painstaking detail can't be applied to every site, and certainly can't be applied by every collecting institution. And even as a relatively big and kind of well-resourced institution, there are still things we can't capture. So we've recently seen sites which we used to be able to capture fine being redesigned with frameworks like React or Angular that make things much more complicated and difficult for us. And these are often sites that we know will be of interest to researchers, so things like databases of government-funded projects. Or we also see lots of kind of data dashboards using products like Power BI or Tableau that are very, very difficult to capture at the moment. So it's really about a kind of call to web developers and especially to decision makers to really try to consider archivability when they're planning their sites, to use techniques like progressive enhancement, and also to try and provide alternative ways of accessing content. So it's great to have a nice dynamic dashboard for your users, but it's even better if you can also provide simple links to download the underlying data as well, that our crawlers will be able to access and capture. So yeah, that's kind of what we were going for, really.
There's plenty for us to be getting into in all of that. And again, it comes back to that issue that, you know, again, thinking about what Paul can open with, the underlying complexity of the web, the underlying complexity, even of web archiving, which was a problem that we thought we had fixed. It's an emerging problem, right? It's an emerging and changing problem, and it only gets more complicated through time. And so actually there's kind of natural evolution. If the bit list is growing, well, it's good that it does, because it's recognizing the real challenges that the community is facing, rather than a sort of imagined set of challenges which might make the headlines for journalism or might help sell products or software. So thank you very much, Jake, for bringing that all to our attention. And as I continue down through this kind of major changes in the list, I mean, there's a lot of work happened around, in particular, a lot of work happened around the museums entry. That's kind of a field which has really been transformed. And I'm going to maybe, if I can bring Sumaya in on that as well. I mean, Sumaya, we've hot on the news. We learned that because of unfortunate circumstances, the British Museum is in the process now. We've promised to digitise all their objects, and I slightly hold my head in my hands when I hear that, having been briefly responsible for a museum trying to digitise all its objects. That's not a simple undertaking, nor is it something you want to do again. I wonder if I could get you to say a word or two about the sort of the state, as it were, state of the art for us in the museums sector, and therefore how we've ended up with the changes that have followed on the list for museums.
Sure, thanks, William. So I guess the state of the museums sector in the context of digital preservation, or the museums and galleries sector, because the DPC has a museums and galleries working group, is that it is behind libraries and archives, and that's unfortunate. But at the same time, it's starting now. There are definitely enough DPC members to have a museums and galleries working group, which perhaps for, you know, in a previous decade that wasn't possible. So I do think it's starting, and I do think that the kinds of collections that you find in museums are, you know, there are the things that you would expect, like 2D still image digitization, which you've just referenced there, William. So those kinds of collections are very much represented right across the bit list. So, you know, 2D digitization, audiovisual digitization, and then the museum sector, because quite a few museums have been doing really technologically innovative things over decades. The Science Museum Group has been doing this kind of work for decades. There are, of course, games and new media and interactive and complex web and a lot more sprinkled throughout the bit list itself. So what we did with the museums entry, it was a single bit list entry that said supporting digital materials for museums and galleries. And the recommendation from the 2021 bit list group was to actually separate out those entries. And we could have left it for the future, but I think, you know, we need it now for the museums and galleries sector. So we did the work, and this is always a collaborative effort. So it was Kieran Niven, who's the digital archivist at the Archaeology Data Service, and Jessica Burge, who's Assistant Director, Heritage Collections and Curation at the University of St Andrews, and myself. And so what we did was take that single entry, and I'd say that the single entry mentioned most of the areas that we split it out into. And so we split this single entry into 6 separate entries, 4 of which we labelled as endangered, and the other 2 as critically endangered. So the endangered ones are collections information management data and systems, so catalogue records, and the legacy databases those catalogue records sit within. I mean, I expect that there will be future iterations of the bit list in the years and decades to come where there is more granularity and detail added. Interpretive materials with gallery exhibitions, and some of that might be quite simple, like text, but other bits of it are, you know, audiovisual materials. Oral histories, there are a lot more oral histories across the museums and galleries, and done in a variety of different ways. So we thought that was worth including, and research materials and outputs that are specifically related to the research done within museums and perhaps by external researchers that don't necessarily have a natural home elsewhere or aren't part of an academic infrastructure, that the research data has somewhere to go. So it does sit around with the museums. But I think the 2 really key things for this work that Kieran and Jessica and I did was around exhibition content. So all of those audiovisual interactives, database-driven things, immersive environments, audiovisual, augmented reality, a few other things, and at least at the Science Museum Group, we have perhaps 4 decades worth of that type of digital content, and some of the legacy equipment, but not always. And so there's a huge amount of that this is not just in our collections, by the way, this is in our organisational records. So some of these things haven't been transferred over to our collections. And so I think this is kind of the fantastic thing about working in the museum sector is it's probably the most interesting corporate records and organisational records I've ever seen in my life. But that exhibitions content is complex, and it does require specialist knowledge, and it is critically endangered because it's sitting on a network drive somewhere. It hasn't been selected for long-term preservation and ingested into a preservation system. And I think the second thing that ties to this, which is really key, is maybe representing one of those interactive exhibitions is more resource than someone has in the future, but people still want to research that. And so what goes with it are all the manuals, the documentation, the technical information, the how to run it, you know, even if it was just the manual that said, when it falls over in the gallery, here's how you restart it, and here's how you configure it if it drops all its settings. So all of those associated materials. And to me, at least, I get more understanding of what that content was from those manuals, but they're scattered around digitally somewhere. Someone will know where it might be, but that's really key for us to be able to do long-term preservation of the exhibition content, but also for future researchers who don't have the resources to, you know, bring all the hardware back. So at least they can get an idea of what that work was. So I think those two things, they're both critically endangered, and it was worth splitting that out. And, you know, the three of us did put a bit of time into it, but you need different viewpoints. And so I guess we would welcome more input for 2025 as well.
Yeah, no, I understood. I think those kind of refinements are really important, and the subject matter knowledge that you've brought, that the team has brought to those questions is tremendously welcome, Samaya. Thank you very much. And listen, I wonder if I can continue the conversation, though. I've got a couple other people to tee up with some new content. Ellie, you've got some handle on the new entries around gaming. Gaming has always been on the bit list, but it's kind of moved around a variety. Every time we've done gaming, it's come out slightly differently. But there's kind of recent research that you've wanted to bring to bear. So maybe I could put you on the kind of on the stand for a moment or two to speak on that.
Yeah, of course. So Amy kind of covered a lot of the changes we made with some new entries and rescoping. It was mostly so we could really highlight the different preservation issues that exists between console games versus PC games, but also to talk a little bit about the impact of various things that the game industry is doing that kind of has a fallout effect on preservation, things such as discontinuation of online services, shutting down storefronts. And the one thing that really caught my eye this year was Phil Salvador published a study in July with the Video Game History Foundation, the Software Preservation Network, where he said that only 13% of classic video games published in the US are currently in release, meaning that 87% of classic video games released in the US are critically endangered. And I saw that and immediately thought of the bit list, given that I think all but one of the entries for gaming are critically endangered or more. And there is some research being done around this area. The National Film and Sound Archive Australia, BFI, and Strong's International Centre for the History of Electronic Games have launched a survey to establish some baseline data. So it's currently quite a fluid area, but it's definitely kind of exciting to see what happens. And I'm almost intrigued to see what happens when we do our very interim update for next year.
Well, thank you very much for that, Ellie. And listen, related, right? You can always have a good discussion about games preservation. We could do this the whole hour. The other area where you can always have a big discussion in digital preservation is around PDF, right? You can't have a bit list without PDF causing a bit of a row and a bit of a conversation. And Paul, you've been kind of leading that. Paul Young from the National Archives, you've been kind of leading that conversation around PDF. So maybe I could hand over to you for a moment to give us a sense around PDFs on the bit list this year.
Yeah, thanks, William. Yeah, I worked with Kate Murray on this, and we were both on the format sort of team. We sort of looked at the current entries, and we felt that they, in the terms of the bit list, that they didn't really need two separate entries anymore. While we felt that PDF had additional risks to PDFA, we felt that there's quite a large amount of open source and commercial tools which you can use to render those formats. So we felt that they sort of could move into the same group with a similar risk category.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that, and for your colleagues, and for Kate, others that have worked on this. I can imagine this now being a conversation for just about every DP Connect for the next 2 years, as we have another conversation around where and how PDFs shape up. Almost done in my tour of all the changes and important changes. I think it's important for us to know also progress. Okay, so we've mentioned the things which are going backwards, but digital preservation is tractable. We can achieve things. We can do these things when we put our minds to it. And the really strong example of that is in research outputs, research data, very broadly defined. Tom, now at King's College London, incidentally, congratulations on the new role. That's been a while now. Tom, you chaired that little group, and I know you've also been working with RL UK and sort of indirectly on some of these matters. So I wonder if I could get you to reflect on the success underpinning the changes around research and research output.
Sure. Thanks, William. It's a real pleasure to be able to celebrate and shine a little bit of a light on some of those successes on World Digital Preservation Day today. And very much still a journey, very much still a work in progress. It's not job done by any means, but I think there are some really positive signs here of us moving in a positive direction. So just to sort of drill into a few examples of that, in terms of research data, we're seeing the development of much stronger links between research publications and research data. So examples of that include requirements for data access statements. So UKRI, the main body overseeing government funding in the UK, now mandates data access statements for research publications that they fund. And I think that helps to ensure that data sets are not kind of cut adrift and on their own, helps to ensure that they're kind of linked into that wider environment. Also seeing ongoing positive change and development in terms of research data management functions. So that's now become really very much a standard of pretty much all university libraries in the UK, at least, and certainly in parts of Europe and the US as well, a very well established type of function, working with and partnering with researchers to ensure that they can store, they can archive, they can preserve the variety of research data sets that they're producing, and hand in hand with that. Also seeing a real embedding of the sort of research data repository infrastructure, that technology much better embedded now, signs of better investment in institutions, and very much that's helping to drive that kind of activity, to drive greater depositing rates, enable research organisations and universities to do greater advocacy around the importance of depositing, archiving and preserving research data. And in the world of research publications, seeing similar signs around things like green open access, where copies of outputs are deposited in repositories alongside a version of record that is typically hosted on a publisher platform. So advantages there in terms of preservations of having more than one copy in different places. So that's an ongoing trend that is certainly a positive there. I just wanted to finish by just mentioning some of the sort of cautions around that, and linking up with William with what you said about the need to avoid complacency in this space. And I think there are, particularly looking at research data sets are many and varied, of course, many different types, ranging from simple statistics and text-based files through to extremely complex things that require specialist software to open them and use them. So still some really important challenges for us to grapple with there, particularly around the preservation of research data sets. I think a really interesting point that I'll finish on as well is, I'm conscious I'm kind of speaking about a lot of this, very much through a kind of UK-centric lens, very much looking at, what is happening in the West. I think there's a really interesting question about the Global South, in terms of research publications that are, produced from organisations and individuals in the Global South. What is what is the state of play there with preservation? At Lancaster, my previous institution, we were doing interesting work there with one of our partners in Malaysia, who were at the early stages of their journey around research data management. But I'm interested as well in, are there also examples of good practice that we're not aware of here in the global north, and are there things also from other domains that we can learn from? So I'll stop there, but it's been great to be able to celebrate some of the kind of signs of a positive direction of travel in the research space.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that, Tom. And it almost feels like a nice kind of connection back to some of the work that Emma and Leo were describing, that internal advocacy, that component, which has helped us to move forward and to set direction which isn't purely led by technology, actually, which is led by making institutional change and understanding at an institutional level the value of the information, the value of the data. And I love very much your comments also about the Global South. That's been revealed to me, really, I think, very strongly in the last couple of years. It's an area that we need to be reflecting more carefully on and thinking how to make progress. Listen, we've been at it now for 57 minutes. And we haven't actually yet released the list to you all. So I'm going to hand to my colleague Sarah and get Sarah to make the official announcement.
Thank you. I wasn't expecting to be part of the part of the presenting team today, but that's quite exciting that I get to do this. So yeah, the official 2023 bit list report will be unveiled to the rest of the world in 2 minutes. But because you're all here and you've listened carefully to us, you get it ahead of time. You get it 2 minutes in advance. So 3, 2, 1. Here is the link to the 2023 official bit list of global endangered digital species. So please, as Amy said at the beginning, dig in, take away from it all of these messages that you've heard today. Use it as an advocacy tool, because that's what it is. Follow the example of Leo and Emma. Do with it what you need to help sort of make progress with digital preservation wherever you are, in your context, in your organisation, and in your community as well. So I'm delighted to have done that and shared that with you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that announcement. So it's just time now for us to bring this hour-long conversation to an end. It's been great. Maybe we could get a round of applause for all the speakers, not just for their conversational pieces today, by the way, but for all the work that they've done. I can't tell you how much work it's been in putting it together, and it's wrong to pick out any individual, but I mean, we should have a standing ovation, of course, in particular for Amy, who's done all the heavy lifting and brought the bit list to completion. And I love, Amy, that as a kind of throwaway comment at the end of your presentation, you opened the link for the corrections, right? So this is good digital preservation practice. We have planned for our own obsolescence in the context of the bit list by already inviting the next edition to be created. Thank you for joining us today. The bit list is yours now to make with, or to do with, as you will, as Sarah has indicated. Thank you to the many people who have contributed. The DPC is a membership organisation. We're a community. If you're not a member of the DPC, now's a chance to do that. Please do get involved to tell us how we're doing. It's not just about what we do, it's also about the leadership that the members have of the coalition. So please do get involved, and I look forward to hearing about all the different ways in which you find ways to make use of the bit list. So thank you all very much for your time today,